Welcome to another episode of The Brand Called You, a podcast and podcast show that brings you leadership lessons, knowledge, experience, and wisdom from thousands of successful individuals from around the world. I'm your host, Ashutosh Garg, and today I'm delighted to welcome a very, very accomplished professional from Hong Kong, Genevieve Hilton. Genevieve, welcome to the show.
Very happy to be here. Thanks for the invitation.
Thank you. Genevieve is a sustainability advisor and a science fiction author. She's the co-chair of the Energy and the ESG Committee of the American Chamber of Commerce of Hong Kong. She's earlier worked with Lenovo and BASF. And as I mentioned, she's a science fiction story writer. And all of you know, I'm very partial to authors. So we'll talk about her books. And she's been recognized, awarded, and felicitated several times. So Genevieve, before we start talking about sustainability, tell me about your own journey and what got you interested in sustainability.
I have one of those career paths where if someone asks me, what do you do? And, how did you get to Hong Kong? Then each step has to be explained by the previous one.
Okay.
So for that reason, I'll start from the earlier end. After university, this was just at the time when the Cold War was winding down and Eastern Europe was opening up, and there's a lot of social change in the world. I spent 2 seasons doing travel writing in the recently changed countries in Eastern Europe, and in Slovakia, Ukraine at the time, which is of course very dear to my heart now, Albania and Poland. And by the time that contract was over, the US embargo on Vietnam had been lifted for the first time. This is in 1994. And as a US citizen, that was very exciting. That was the place to be, as a forbidden planet. So I went there with my then boyfriend, and not too long after that embargo was lifted. Ended up working for a small PR agency. But in Vietnam, it's a developing country. It was just opening up at the time. And I ended up spending 6 years there. There was a lot of interesting development work being done, both at the top level. So for one of my clients, for example, was the United Nations, the Reproductive Health Alliance, but also at the grassroots level. So one of my clients was the Hanoi Club, which started a little grassroots NGO called the West Lake Preservation Group. And that's kind of where it all started.
Okay.
And so from there, after I moved to Hong Kong, it's around 2000, I'm still working in communications, but always very much with working on sustainability type clients, social projects, and this term started to change, became CSR, corporate social responsibility. And then it somehow around the mid 2000s, people started calling it, sustainability. And now the trend is to talk about the codified version that is useful for investors, which is ESG. So here's where we are now.
Fascinating. So when you talk sustainability, what, in your opinion, are some of the key sustainability challenges the world faces?
Well, there's the big one that is on top of everything else, of course, which is climate. And no other sustainability topic can be discussed without talking about climate.
Correct.
And one of the reasons I like this more modern term ESG is because it's all taken in one. Everything environmental impacts everything social and vice versa. We have climate migrants who are going to be pushed away from their home countries or from their homelands because of climate change. But neither the environmental nor the social change can happen without good governance. And I'm coming from the corporate world, so often governance means, a well-run company can also be a very sustainable company, but generally not the other way around.
Well said. And, staying with the corporate world, how seriously is sustainability being taken in the boardrooms?
I don't think there is a boardroom around the world that hasn't at least discussed the topic in the last year. It went from, yes, nice to have, we should give a check to charity sometimes, to, those sustainability people, let them deal with the activists, to this is something that the investors are interested in. And that's happened just in the last year or two.
And do you think the pandemic had anything to do with that?
Yeah, maybe. Maybe there's something, but I don't see the direct relationship. I think it's probably something more like the the culmination of decades of people, plugging away at this. There's a great friend of mine from an organization called the Triple Bottom Line Institute who says, "Oh yeah, it's this new thing that I only started doing 25 years ago." Yeah, it's been around.
I agree. So my next question is, when I used to live in Singapore, there was a very senior political leader from one of the countries who went for the Brazil conference, and this was the mid-90s, and said that you're asking us not to cut down our rainforests because that's needed for the world, but the developed world has already cut down all there, and that's our wealth. So I wanted to ask you, why is sustainability crucial for financial markets?
Well, the topic I mentioned a minute ago, the fact that it is all connected, is not getting less, it's getting more and more and more. So if you talk about having manufacturing in India, then you talk about potentially increasing emissions in India.
Correct.
But not every product manufactured in India has every one of its components made in India. Maybe they're made somewhere else. And not every product is being consumed in India. So a lot of times the emissions of a product happen after it's made, when it's in use by the consumer.
Correct.
So that's, all together, that is not, it's impossible to look at anything from a single market point of view. And all the world's multinationals are very much looking at that multiple market point of view.
Interesting. My next question to you is on culture. Different countries, different cultures handle nature very, very differently. I wanted to ask you, does culture impact views on sustainability?
Yes, it can impact how the individual market, the individual group of people tackle the issue. But in terms of how high a priority the long-term view is, I think that's probably more in line with the development level. So you have places like Sweden or Norway are generally recognized to be strong sustainability strategy, companies headquartered there. But it's also a very developed country. On the other hand, you have somewhere which is a developing market, and you have people who are trying to take themselves out of poverty. They just do not have the time to look at the long term. And that's really what sustainability is all about, is looking at the long-term view. So if you have to worry about your meal tomorrow, if you're a small company worrying about making payroll that week, and I've run a small company before, I have to worry about, I know what it's like to have to worry about making payroll. It's very hard to think about what's happening in the next 50 years.
Well said. And therefore, natural question to you after this is that, does an ambitious GDP target have any contradictions with a sustainability strategy for a country?
Not necessarily. Not necessarily. And the reason I say so is because a lot of times a place which is maybe in a middle stage of development, somewhere like India, there's a huge middle class, but also just huge everything, right? It's one of the largest country in the world, or about to be. It also does not have a lot of the entrenched, say, legacy issues that more developed markets have. So, it hasn't been doing it this way for 100 years already. That means you're free to do the new way. You're free to power this entire province with solar, if you like. Whereas somewhere that already has the infrastructure there, with the coal-fired power plant that was built 5 years ago, but is expected to work for another 50, you can't change that. But when you're looking at growth and expansion, you can often do things in new ways which are more efficient than the old ways. And to keep in mind as well, that also means that there is a huge opportunity for experimentation. And as for example, in a place as big as India, that you can try it out in this province. Maybe that doesn't work well, but you've learned something. Apply those lessons to another province, and this can be magical when it works.
Well said. My next question to you is about the young leaders. And I'm from the boomers generation, and I know that my generation has really messed up a lot of the sustainability and climate change issues that the world is facing. And in your opinion, how are the millennials and the Gen Zs changing the way we think about sustainability?
Well, let me give a short shout out to Gen X, my generation, the always forgotten generation that nobody mentions when they jump from boomers to millennials.
Okay.
But yeah, it's obviously a fact. This is something that a lot of companies have to think about when they're looking at their sustainability strategy. Does this impact how our employees will be giving a discretionary effort? And I'd say specifically discretionary effort. Like almost nobody will totally refuse to take a job when it's right for them on the table, or they won't quit a company necessarily because of its sustainability strategy, but they will give that extra effort when they believe what they're in the company's purpose. And that is absolutely a thing, yes, in Gen X, especially so for millennials and especially so for Zoomers. And that can be the difference, right? Every company who says, oh, our greatest asset is our people, the ones who believe it, they know the greatest asset really is the people. That's what makes the difference between mediocre success and success.
Well said. The next question that I wanted to ask you was about the pandemic. They say the positive part of the pandemic was that since human beings stayed indoors, Mother Nature got a time to heal herself. And we had these amazing stories in India, 150 kilometers away, you could see the clear mountains or animals coming out in Scandinavia and so on and so forth. My question is, do you think Mother Nature has the ability to heal herself? And what role should we as human beings be playing in letting our Earth be?
I saw one of those great internet memes recently, which was this is a machine that will absorb carbon and is long lasting, can last for over 100 years, and all you need to do is leave it alone, and that was of course a tree. So yeah, Mother Nature is fine without humans. I mean, with that, Mother Nature will go ahead. It's not nature that needs us. We need nature.
Correct.
It's the other way around.
Correct.
But I can only see this if anyone was able to see, oh yes, nature is healing. The whales are back into this bay, or the endangered species is coming back. If this is something that the local population is able to see in real time and observe that recovery, it makes it extremely tangible, because you can talk about high-flown sustainability concepts like, oh yes, do we get our SBTI approvals, targets approved? But on the other hand, you see literally, okay, this is a fish that wasn't here before. That makes it very tangible, and it drives action. That's true, by the way, in the corporate world. A lot of times people will say, like, the big issue is we need to think about the emissions of our production sites. We shouldn't worry about, turning the lights off in the office. On the other hand, though, I've always said making those little changes, like do you sort your recycling in the office pantry? Do you, have the lights turned off and, the air conditioners on the most efficient setting? Those things do influence the people who are sitting in the office, because they're real, they can tell. Then they go and make decisions about the factories.
You're so right, because I think each one of us in our own small way can contribute. And, these small contributions can actually become a tidal wave of supporting sustainability.
Yes, but also because if the business executive is habitually obliged to think about these things on a daily basis, even if his little light switch turning on or off doesn't make a big difference, he's thinking about it all the time. He's going to go back into that boardroom, he or she, if she's going to go back into that boardroom and say, you know what, maybe we should be like my ex-company, BASF. They recently built a bio-based polyol plant in India, first one in the world. I don't want to say that because someone told them to turn the lights off in the office, but it has that overall sustainability thinking absolutely contributes.
Fascinating. So now let me move to your books. As a science fiction storyteller, when I read about you, when I was reading about you, I said sustainability on the other one side and science fiction on the other. Let me start by asking you, what got you interested in science fiction, especially given the background you told me about moving from one country to the other, and
I mean, I love reading in general, and some of the most exciting stories about the human condition are those in science fiction. Because science fiction is never really about science. It's about people exploring topics like, what does it mean to be a human being? What does it mean, if you take people out of their natural habitat and put them somewhere else? How will they survive? Will they thrive? And there's a much stronger link than you might imagine. Just not too long ago, I was reading it's a fairly major science fiction book by Neil Stephenson called The Seven Eves. Without giving away too much of the plot. At a certain point, the last remnants of humanity, about 100 people, are in a spaceship. Floating in space. You know what they do? They form political parties and they argue with each other. And I was reading it, I almost got angry, saying, like, what are you people thinking? Your entire species is at risk. You're floating in space. How can you be arguing with each other? And I thought, well, yeah, I also looked at the latest, COP27 arguments of the people of Earth arguing with each other, and we're on a planet floating in space. We only got one of them. So, yeah, it was kind of a big revelation in my mind at that moment.
Fascinating. But tell me a little bit more about, say, any one story that you have written. And where can our viewers and listeners read about these stories or read these stories?
Well, you will see a lot of my, I think probably easiest to read online is a lot of the short fiction. So you can see that in places under Soft Star magazine, which is one I like very much because it's optimistic science fiction. And also you can read my book, which is called Route One and Other Stories. And it's a lot of, you'll see the recurring theme of, what does it mean to be human? What does it mean to put a human on another planet? Do they have the resources that they need? One story I recently published was about a mining asteroid that ends up being the place where humanity has to rush to after a disaster on Earth. It was actually inspired by a cyclone shelter that I built that I was involved with, not built personally, but I was involved with in Bangladesh. So it was originally meant as a school, so it's a part of a charitable project that my company was involved in. But we worked on making also a cyclone shelter, so it had a dual purpose. So in the story, it's a mining asteroid, it's a mining colony on an asteroid, but it also has a secondary purpose as being a refuge for humanity in case anything happens on Earth.
Amazing. You're the first science fiction writer that I'm speaking to out of the 1,800 odd people I've spoken to. But tell me, what kind of research do you have to do before you write a book or a story on science fiction?
Oh, well, it is whatever the topic is, and it can be quite amazing, just the diversity of what people I end up talking to. And I could probably host a podcast myself with just the people I've discussed this with. Just for example, I had written a short story in which one of the characters is a fruit fly, a geneticist working with fruit flies. And then I eventually expanded that I'm working on expanding that into a book. And I had to find out more about genetics, more about fruit flies. Found through a series of friends, ended up talking to the head of a fruit fly lab in California.
Wow.
And was busily typing as, she said, oh yeah, hold on, I have to change my water bath. What does that mean? I found out about the interrelationships between the fruit fly people and the white mice people. Apparently it's not as friendly as you might imagine.
Amazing. Amazing.
But
Fascinating.
then, of course, the ordinary research that anybody has to do, if I set the story in California and one person works in this location and lives in this location, I have to check Google Maps to see how long it takes to get there in the morning or whether they're going to have traffic.
Correct. Well said. So I have time for two more questions. My next question continues with science fiction. You also say that science fiction is closely linked with sustainability. Help me understand this.
Well, I started to talk about that a moment ago when I said looking at resources. And you'll notice that it's been a little bit of a trend in the last decade or so, this topic of post-apocalyptic science fiction. And a lot of that is actually based on things like global pandemics, Emily St. John Mandel's book, Station 11. It's talked about climate disasters. So the recent book by Kim Stanley Robinson called The Ministry of the Future. And these are core topics that, what if? And that's what allows this kind of long-term scenario planning. What is our world going to look like in 5 or 10 or 20 or 100 years? And if we go down this pathway. So I think the other option if you want to think about it this way is the multiple universes. So if we go down this pathway, what would it look like? If we take this pathway, what would it look like?
Amazing. I must read some more science fiction to understand it a little more. But my last question to you, Genevieve, and that this is for the thousands of people who will listen to our conversation. Based on your understanding of sustainability, what would you say are 3 lessons you would want our viewers and listeners to take away from your own journey and from our conversation?
So lessons in sustainability is that it is not the sustainability team's job to do the sustainability, and everybody else can do the non-sustainable stuff. So whether it's a small company or a large company, or it's an NGO or a university, healthcare, it doesn't matter where you work. There is a sustainability element to your job.
Yeah.
So if you're in HR, maybe it's recruiting the people who have that mindset. If you are in finance, maybe it's helping the CFO to see where the expenditures are making, what's cost effective, what's more or less cost effective. If you're in product development, it's developing the right product. So it doesn't matter where you are, what you do. The second one, I think, is related to the first one, and that's to look at what sustainability people call this materiality. So what is material? What is important to your company? And I think in the early 2000s and 1990s, a lot of companies made this mistake of saying, I can do this unsustainable thing, and then I make up for it by donating to charity. But it's the thing itself that has to be addressed. So if you are building a production site and you produce widgets at that production site, your sustainability job is to figure out how do you make those widgets in a better way, maybe with less environmental impact, with the correct way of engaging with your neighbors and the surrounding community, with ensuring your workers are being fairly treated, and the often forgotten ESG, and making sure you're running that business well. And then I think the third point on sustainability is that it's only in the last few years when we started to have this term called ESG, which is more about codifying sustainability information for the purpose of helping investors look at it, that we are really starting to get to the point of having some kind of measurement criteria that will be useful. And it's always been a problem. Financially speaking, we have this thing called currency, and I know how many rupees or how many dollars this is worth. We have a unit of measurement. But doing something in sustainability, and my first job is to invent the concept of currency. We don't have a sustainability dollar that exists in the world, and it's a little bit too complicated. So getting to the point where you can measure that impact, no matter how, somehow measure that impact, is really the first step and the ultimate step of being able to do sustainability in a useful way.
Very interesting. Very, very interesting. And on that note, thank you so much for speaking to me and your wonderful lessons. We are all responsible for sustainability. Or as I was speaking to a very senior corporate leader, and I said, what are your thoughts on sustainability? He says, we've given the responsibility to our CHRO, and we've given them a chief sustainability officer. So I said, well, now I understand what your company is doing about it. The second point that you made was that the materiality, and people need to understand what is really important to our companies, and therefore work around that. And we've had many times, we've had this so-called guilt that, okay, I'm doing this, let me give a check to someone else. I've seen this happen many times. And the third one you talked about was how important it is to start measuring and creating measurements or indices that we can help to understand sustainability. Thank you so much, Genevieve, for speaking to me about your own journey, about sustainability. And I think I learned a lot of new things about sustainability from you. Thank you also for introducing me to science fiction story writing. And I'm going to reach out and read some of your stories. But maybe you've introduced me to a new genre of stories which I've never read before. Thank you again for speaking to me, and good luck.
Thank you so much. Have a great day.
Thank you for listening to the Brand Called You videocast and podcast, a platform that brings you knowledge, experience, and wisdom of hundreds of successful individuals from around the world. Do visit our website www.tbcy.in to watch and listen to the stories of many more individuals. You can also follow us on YouTube, Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. Just search for the Brand Called You.